All praises to the Most High, Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahweh Shai, Ba'ashem Raha Kodash. Double honors to the elder apostles and elder bishops of Great Millstone who rule well. Peace and salutations to the hopeful elect, scattered throughout the four corners of the earth, laboring in His truth in all sincerity. Jeremiah 50 and 25, NLT. Yahweh has opened His armory and brought out weapons to vent His fury. The terror that falls upon the Babylonians will be the work of the sovereign Yahweh of heaven's armies. This will be the final installment of a 7-part video series titled 7 Symptoms of Babylon's Impending Doom. And just to recap the previous 6 videos here, Part 1 focused on economic decline. Part 2 was social and cultural decay. Part 3, political corruption and instability. Part 4 was military overextension. Part 5, environmental issues. And Part 6 was focused on the changing demographics of America, aka Babylon the Great. The theme of Part 7 will focus on the external threats that pose immediate dangers to America before she turns 250 years old officially on July 4th next year. That's July 4th of 2026. And so just like the opening scripture stated, Yahweh has opened His armory, and hath brought forth the weapons of His indignation. So let's start off by reading an article that I came across in the New York Post. This article was dated earlier today, December 31st, so-called New Year's Eve, 6:05 a.m. The Washington Monument will glow on New Year's Eve to kick off America's 250th anniversary. So they're getting started early here. You know, officially it's July 4th, which is the 250th anniversary of this country gaining its independence from Great Britain. But it looks like they're not even going to wait until July 4th. They're getting officially started now, January 1st, it looks like. So once again, that video title is Washington Monument will glow on New Year's Eve to kick off America's 250th anniversary. It's going to be lit. And of course, they would use a Jake slang to get off this, to basically start this article here. But it's going to be lit. The Washington Monument will double as a giant birthday candle on New Year's Eve to kick off the year-long celebration of America's 250th anniversary. Freedom 250, a non-profit group launched by President Nero earlier this month to lead the semi-quincentennial festivities, plans to illuminate the towering obelisk on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., with patriotic projections telling the story of America starting on Wednesday. And that is what it's going to look like. That is the Washington Monument, the Egyptian obelisk. And you see that they have the red, white, and blue, the so-called stars and stripes with the number 250 to represent America's turning 250 years old next year. And this was a test run of the lights, and this will shine on the landmark New Year's Eve. I'll just read a little bit more. The illumination of the Washington Monument marks the beginning of a momentous year for our nation, 250 years since the signing of the Declaration of Independence, said Keith Crotch, CEO of Freedom 250. We invite every American and every friend of America to join this historic celebration of the triumph of the American spirit. I'll pretty much probably stop there, I should say. That's another look at it, what it's going to look like. There it is again. And this right here, this bottom picture, where it's greenish towards the top, this was actually last night. The Washington Monument lit up in multiple colors on the National Mall of Washington, D.C. on December 30th, 2025. That was just yesterday. The moment will be accompanied by a large-scale fireworks display at midnight, according to Freedom 250, filling the sky above the National Mall in a powerful visual finale. Trump has also teased plans to construct a huge triumphal arch across the Potomac River from the Lincoln Memorial and host a UFC match on the grounds of the White House. So, this is just like ancient Rome, basically. This is, he wants UFC fights, as part of the festivities, just like the gladiators used to fight in the Colosseums and stuff. So this is basically what Nero is doing. He just really hasn't stopped at all. He's just picked up from where he left off. So let's look at this here. I wanted to see what this link was. Freedom 250, a nonprofit group launched by President Nero. Oh, it's another New York Post article. Trump reveals Patriot Games for high school athletes as part of America's 250th anniversary celebration, which is basically what I just said. This is almost like, this is ancient Rome all over again. Now he has high school athletes along with a UFC fight. This is basically to help commemorate the 250th birthday celebration. This is like the ancient gladiators fighting in the Colosseums. If you look down here at the second paragraph, well, let's just start at the first. High school athletes from around the country will converge next year to compete in a new athletic competition as part of the United States 250th birthday celebration. Nero announced on Thursday the newly minted Patriot Games will be a first-of-its-kind athletic event spanning across 4 days and featuring one young man and one young woman from each state and territory. So I think we all get the gist there. Don't want to get too far off topic. The first-of-its-kind athletic competition will spotlight male and female high school athletes from every state and territory. Blah, blah, blah. Democrats immediately bashed the Patriot Games by comparing the athletic event to dystopian novel-turned-film series The Hunger Games. And so it was decreed that each year the various districts of Panem would offer up in tribute one young man and woman to fight to the death in a pageant of honor, courage, and sacrifice. The Hunger Games 2012, the official Democratic Party X account posted, and the backlash was swift. So the Olympics are dystopian as well, one commentator asked, and that seems like a sarcastic or rhetorical question. But let's get back to the actual topic. And this is, I opened up with Jeremiah 50 and 25. Yes. So as we can see, this particular so-called New Year's Eve before heading into 2026, it's especially significant because 2026 is the 250th anniversary of this country's inception, led by Nero in the reincarnation himself. But through all the festivities and all the celebrations, those 6 symptoms I recapped earlier, in addition to the 7th symptom here, external threats, will all play a factor in the total collapse of this system. Some of those external threats would be, you have this country here, the United States and China, basically in a race as to who's going to surpass who and maintain the advantage as far as artificial intelligence. These two countries are pretty much running neck and neck in terms of artificial intelligence technology. So with that being said, this is why this country is having to bring in so many Southeast Asians and stuff like that to keep up with China. They're saying that if this country did not do that, China would run laps around this country as far as technologically and as far as artificial intelligence. You also have Russia's willingness to wage war against NATO. Iran continues to advance its nuclear program. You have all of that, along with all of the previous mentioned countries, Moab, Russia, and Iran. Now, this would also include North Korea. They have cyber operations. All of these countries have cyber operations that they can operate from their country. And these include espionage, extortion, financial gain. Look at Somalia. Somalia is a good example. You have a whole network right now, right here in Minnesota, but somehow they're able to funnel billions of dollars from this particular country back into Somalia. So we also have cyber attacks. We have to also worry about in terms of things that threaten U.S. interests. There's also what's known as transnational criminal organizations. That would be stuff like the cartels. The cartels, they receive fentanyl or opium from China, and then they funnel it into this country to where you start seeing by the hundreds, people are just, and by the thousands almost, on a weekly or monthly basis, people are overdosing throughout the country on fentanyl. You see people doing the fentanyl lean, the methylene or whatever. People just bent over. They all kind of, their bodies are distorted, pretty much looking like they're like possessed almost. So these are all just some of the external threats that this country is facing now. That's pretty much just the tip of the iceberg, just lightly touching on the battle for artificial intelligence between China and the US. That's just slightly looking at Iran and North Korea's nuclear ambitions, and all of these countries relying more on cyber attacks, cyber criminals and computer hackers. They target U.S. infrastructure, government systems, the private sector, transportation industry, along with communications and natural resource grids and stuff like that. This country, we've been hearing for the longest now that the electric grid here is actually susceptible to being, knocked out. And if that happens, you would have an entire region with no electricity. So these type of external threats is basically what the U.S. is constantly facing now. So, and this isn't really anything new. This has been ongoing. It's just now that these countries have been able to step it up a notch now. It's no longer where America is the only superpower in the world now. So these other countries are no longer backing down. So the U.S. is on constant alert for this. And you have to ask the question, with so many foreign nationals already in this country, what would make anyone believe that the enemy is not already within? If Somalis can put together a multi-billion-dollar scheme in this country to funnel money back to their homeland, what makes anyone so sure that more advanced countries, such as China, for instance, is not already doing the same? U.S. money is funding its enemies, basically. So the more U.S. taxpayer dollars go out this country, they're not going to leave that money is not leaving this country and, building infrastructure someplace else. That money is leaving this country to fund its enemies. Whether the U.S. is a part of that with the CIA or not, doesn't matter if they're a part of it or not. It's just a matter that it's happening. You're strengthening your enemy and their militaries and their ability to wage war on you, not just militarily, but also through, cyber attacks, artificial intelligence, this type of stuff. So just something to keep an eye on. You have a lot of foreign nationals here that may already be working against you. So that brings me to Jeremiah 51:14. And I'll read this in the KJV. Yahweh of hosts has sworn by himself, saying, surely I will fill thee with men as with caterpillars, and they shall lift up a shout against thee. And those caterpillars are already inside. Remember when you was a kid, you used to watch the cartoons with the caterpillar inside the apple. That's the caterpillar already inside and devouring. He's eating. He's already inside. He's already infiltrated. So those caterpillars, they're in your hospitals now. They're in your universities. They're in your halls of Congress. They're within your military ranks, your law enforcement. China is buying up huge amounts of farmland. This is our food supply here, and anything else that we use or consume, China is owning a huge part of that land, or whatever they don't own, either the U.S. government or Bill Gates owns. So you're pretty much, if you're not able to grow your own food at this point, you're pretty much at the mercy of what Babylon, decides you're going to put into your body, if you decide, obviously, to buy that particular type of stuff. So just something to think about. But so yeah, once again, Jeremiah 51:14, Yahweh of hosts hath sworn by himself, saying, surely I will fill thee with men as with caterpillars, and they shall lift up a shout against thee. Yes, they shall lift up a shout against thee. Just like Ishmael yelling at the top of his lungs that Islam will be in every household in the New York City. And I know people have probably seen those videos circulating around everywhere. You'll start seeing, all of a sudden you walk through Times Square or any place in New York City or Michigan, and there's like hundreds of Muslims gathered in the park. You know, out of all these mosques that they're building, they want to be outside praying in your neighborhoods, in your shopping districts. That's basically what you call a show of force. That's a show of force there, where we're not going to pray in our buildings that we is, constructed for that purpose. We're going to do this outside. This is basically, it's a passive aggressive call to arms. It's a passive aggressive means of showing force. So, and these are the same people that screaming like, Sharia law and will be the law of the land. This is all I'm seeing lately. It's just, these Muslim imams bold enough to now get on camera right here in this country and say that Sharia law will be the law of the land, or that, Islam is going to enter every single home in this country. And you're also hearing now in Michigan, Minnesota, the it happens 5 times a day. They're called to prayer. So just things to think about. As you can see, and I went into this with the changing demographics of Babylon. You're starting to see a shift here. Western white European culture is on its way out. Doesn't matter if anyone agrees with that. It's just the reality. So, even though, we hear these guys say Sharia law will be the law of the land, we know that that's bullshit, because it doesn't line up with biblical prophecy. You have Ishmael right now along with Amalek. They're basically chasing the kingdom on this side. And that's what they're doing. That's what their whole motivation is. They believe they can bring the kingdom in on this side. No, only the Most High, Yahweh Bashem, Yahweh Shai, can usher in the kingdom like that, can actually bring it in. So we know that when we hear them say Sharia law will be the law of the land, we do know, though, that that is bullshit. That's just to be clear on that. And you also have Elamite politicians like Vivek Ramaswamy, saying that the idea of heritage Americans is silly. So basically telling all of these white Americans who can probably actually trace their lineage back, at least to the very least, to the 1870 census, or possibly even to 1776, even though that would probably only be like 25 to 30% of the white population in this country. Most whites in this country didn't start coming here until, the Ellis Islanders started coming over. But there's probably maybe I would guesstimate 25 to 30% can probably actually trace their lineage back to 1870, which is the first census after the Civil War, or possibly 1776. But you got an Elamite like Vivek Ramaswamy telling them to their faces that a heritage American, just that very idea, is silly. So like I was saying earlier, these caterpillars are already inside, and they're using this country's immigration and citizenship laws. They're using all of the holes in their immigration laws against them. Incidentally, this is similar to how the so-called Native Americans lost the land. They were unable to control their borders and ports until they were finally overcome. Now Esau, Edom is losing this country the same way they took it, except now that their very own laws are being used against them. So now let's take a look at Isaiah chapter 10. And I'll read 12 through 16 in the NLT. After Yahweh has used the king of Assyria to accomplish his purposes on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, he will turn against the king of Assyria and punish him, for he is proud and arrogant. He boasts, "By my own powerful arm I have done this. With my own shrewd wisdom I planned it. I have broken down the defenses of nations and carried off their treasures. And I have knocked down their kings like a bull. I have robbed their nest of riches and gathered up kingdoms as a farmer gathers eggs. No one can even flap a wing against me, or utter a peep of protests." Incidentally, that sounds something just like Trump would say, where it says he boasts, "By my own powerful arm I have done this. With my own shrewd wisdom I planned it. I have broken down the defenses of nations and carried off their treasures. I have knocked down their kings like a bull. I have robbed their nest of riches and gathered up kingdoms as a farmer gathers eggs. No one can even flap a wing against me or utter a peep of protest." That sounds just like something Nero would say. Wasn't Nero just bragging how he just snatched up Venezuela's oil ships or something like that? It sounds just like something he would say. But, verse 15. "But can the axe boast greater power than the person who uses it? Is the saw greater than the person who saws? Can a rod strike unless a hand moves it? Can a wooden cane walk by itself? Therefore, the Lord Yahweh of heaven's armies will send a plague among Assyria's proud troops, and a flaming fire will consume its glory." Let's take a look at what is BRICS, the ultimate goal as it pertains to the American dollar. So we all know what BRICS is. There's no need to really go into that. It's an acronym that basically means Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and they are looking to replace the American dollar. So BRICS' ultimate goal regarding the US dollar is de-dollarization, to decrease reliance on the dollar in global trade and finance by using local currencies for bilateral trade, developing alternative payment systems like BRICS Pay, and potentially creating a new shared currency or settlement unit to foster a multipolar financial system and reduce vulnerability to U.S. economic pressures or sanctions. Right. And we all know how the U.S. likes to sanction these particular countries. They basically steal their resources. They start bombing them if they don't acquiesce to whatever demands, the U.S. has. They basically starving them, snatching their resources, and they use their refugees to come here, and their refugees come here and become basically debt slaves like everyone else in America. And that's America's plan. I guess you can say you legally get rid of slavery, but this is just a backhand way now of still bringing in slaves here. You deprive countries and people of resources, and then you start bombing them to where their place now is uninhabitable, and you kind of force them to come here as refugees. Now, some of them are able to get over, like a lot of these Somalis that I was talking about earlier. They were able to kind of stick it to Babylon a little bit. But then you have some other people from third world countries. They come here and they're nothing more than debt slaves. They get up every single day. They go to work for 25, 30 years, only to find out that now they're going to be deported. Only to find out that, your paperwork isn't correct and we don't care how long you've been here. Get out of the country with no retirement benefits. You can either leave the country, we'll give you $1,000, or we can escort you out the country and you get nothing. So that's pretty much how it is. So let's look some more at this. Local key strategies and goals. Local currency trade, encouraging trade between member nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and new members using their currencies instead of the dollar. Alternative pay systems, developing systems like BRICS, paid to bypass Western dominated platforms like SWIFT, allowing for direct local currency transactions, reduce vulnerability, shielding economies from U.S. sanctions, and the impact of fluctuating U.S. money policies. I think we all get the point here. Basically, BRICS is tired of it. BRICS is tired of the U.S. bullying them as well as other nations all around the world with the strength of the U.S. dollar. So how do you combat that? You create a rival. You create the ability to band together as opposing nations with a different currency, a currency that you're not going to have to worry about getting sanctioned or you having to deal with America, and next thing you know, they betray you one way or the other and just start taking your resources anyway. Let's take a look at Proverbs 11:1 real fast. A false balance is an abomination to Yahweh Bashem Yahweh Shai, but a just weight is his delight. Right, and that goes back to what I was stating. These countries are tired, and this is why the Most High is using these countries, just as my opening verse stated. If we go back to Jeremiah 50:25, the NLT, Yahweh has opened his armory and brought out the weapons to vent his fury. So we all know that the U.S., their way of doing things is unjust. It's not a balanced scale at all. The U.S. has been doing, shady tactics. This is how this country was as coming to come into be. You come into be by a genocide and slavery, essentially, and you maintain it with debt slaves. And so this is everything about this country. These are all just unrighteous decrees constantly that this country is bringing forth. There's nothing righteous about its judicial system, its political system. There's nothing righteous with some of the things that these presidents be signing into law. Is just nothing righteous at all. All of this is an abomination to the Most High, Yahweh Bashem Yahweh Shai, which is why he's using these other countries now. This is why you have a BRICS nations now. This is why you have these countries standing up to the United States now. These are some of the external threats that this country is facing. Let's take a look at Acts. Chapter 2, now start from verse 18. Now I'll just read this in the NLT. In those days I will pour out my spirit, even on my servants, men and women alike, and they will prophesy. And I will cause wonders in the heavens above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and clouds of smoke. So, you've been hearing a lot lately about Three-Eye Atlas. Three-Eye Atlas is the interstellar comet, as they have here on Google AI overview, but I think it's pretty much well known now that this is not a comet. It does not behave like a comet. But they say it's acting strange due to its unique lumpy nature, releasing gas jets unevenly, creating wobbling tails, even an anti-tail pointing sunward. This anti-tail, I don't know if you can imagine taking let's say you take a football, you dump a football in a bucket, and then you throw this particular football. The water that was on that football that you just brought out of the bucket, that water, as that football is traveling forward, that water will be moving backwards. That's just physics. In this particular case, though, imagine dumping that football in water, pulling it out, and then throwing it as the ball is going forward, the water is in front of it. And that's basically what this anti-tail is. It's defying physics as we know it and as we understand it. So they say it's spinning rapidly and exhibiting surprising chemical makeup, lots of CO2, less carbon chains, more nickel for its distance from the sun, making it a fascinating interstellar visitor defying typical comet expectations, though it's likely natural, just very unusual, so they say. And what is this? So, 8 burning theories that this could prove 3i Atlas is an alien spacecraft, according to Harvard scientists. This article was published December 30th, 2025 at approximately 6 a.m. This is on NewYorkPost.com. The author is someone by the name of Ben Cost. I'm not going to get into all 8 of these. I'm just trying to use this as an example of a potential external threat because we really don't know what this is as of yet. I'm going to refrain from making any assumptions about it, but I will say that this is one of those things that I think is serious enough to at least put in this particular video here regarding external threats. And it's really because it has these Edomites spooked. They really don't know what it is. So could these signs be of artificial 3i intelligence with 3i Atlas streaking away from our planet? Speculation remains as to whether the interstellar comet is alien or not. NASA has staunchly maintained that the cosmic interloper is of cometary provenance, while Harvard scientist Avi Loeb has doubled down on claims that it could be technological. So I'm going to try to get to the main points here. You can't just say, I know the answer and ignore the anomalies. That's not viable, Loeb told the Post, because it could be a black swan event, an unlikely seeming phenomenon that seems inevitable in retrospect. We must consider the possibility that it's technological. So if you want to read this article, like I said, you can go to yesterday's edition of the New York Post. And once again, that particular article is 8 burning theories that this could prove 3i Atlas is an alien spacecraft. And let's just see. He says, my general hope is that the best is yet to come in terms of new data and what we learn about 3i Atlas. It's just a whole bunch of rambling, not a whole lot about anything, just their speculation and their wishful thinking, essentially. So with that being said, let's go into Psalms 68 and 17. Something that's a little more or a whole lot more, straightforward. And I'll read this in the KJV. The chariots of Elohim are 20,000, even thousands of angels. Yahushai is among them, as in Sinai in the holy place. And I did use Yahushai there because that is a capital L, lowercase O-R-D. All caps would be Yahweh. So that would be Adon, or Adon, I believe, in the ancient Paleo-Hebrew. Adonai is the Lord. So the chariots of Elohim are 20,000, even thousands of angels. Yahushai is among them, as in Sinai in the holy place. So, whereas even if 3i Atlas is just an interstellar object, like a comet, one of those external threats that, plague Babylon are going to be the chariots of Yahweh Bashem Yahushai. So, we're seeing more and more credible footage of chariot sightings as well. All over social media, people are actually getting good footage. We're seeing these things more and more. And these are those external threats. These are potential external threats. I'm not going to say that every single anything that we see flying is absolutely a chariot, but it's just something to keep your eye on as we enter these end times here, that we are seeing actual credible footage of chariots and these external threats will continue to play Babylon until this place is just no more. Esau knows this as well as the other nations. So, which is why, there's so much talk of like Space Force and fighting these potential threats. I think I discussed that back in part 4 of this particular series, that was military overextension. They got their Space Force, and they have these dreams and fantasies of fighting these these, which they're not going to be able to do. So 3-Eye Atlas definitely has them spooked. We know that the Most High's word, it never comes back void. And in this particular 6-part series here, we're seeing all of these prophecies coming to pass right as the supposed new year, is just a few short hours away. And next year is the year that this country turns 250 years. So it's going to get real interesting here. It's just something to keep your eye on. Obviously, we want to remain diligent in this truth and continue to do the work. And as we come up on this country's 250th anniversary, we won't be celebrating it, but we will be occupied in prophecies as we are instructed. So with that being said, I'm going to end this with this entire series here, parts 1 through 7, and this is going to be the final verse for this particular series. Isaiah 46:10 KJV, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. I pray this has been edifying and reaches the ears it's supposed to reach. Shalom.